The evening air was cool, and the city street was slowly filling with people looking for a place to eat after a long day. Cars moved past the bright lights of shops and cafes, and the sound of quiet conversations floated through the sidewalks. One restaurant near the corner stood out more than the others. Its warm yellow lights shone through large glass windows, and soft piano music could sometimes be heard from inside. People passing by often slowed down for a moment to look through the windows before stepping inside. Inside the restaurant, everything felt calm and comfortable. Families sat around tables covered with clean white cloths. Couples leaned close to each other while talking quietly. Waiters moved smoothly from table to table carrying plates filled with fresh meals. The smell of warm bread, soup, and grilled food filled the air. But just a few steps outside that same restaurant, the night felt very different for someone standing near the entrance. A young street girl stood near the wall beside the door. She watched the people walking in and out of the restaurant. Her clothes looked worn from many days on the street, and the sleeves of her sweater were slightly too long for her hands. Her shoes were old and dusty, and one of them had a small tear near the front. She held her arms close to her body, trying to stay warm. The evening breeze moved softly along the street, and every time someone opened the restaurant door, a wave of warm air and the smell of food drifted outside. That smell made her stomach twist with hunger. She had not eaten a proper meal all day. Earlier in the afternoon, she had walked through several busy streets hoping to find small work or someone willing to help. Sometimes people gave a small coin. Most of the time, they just walked past quickly, avoiding eye contact. The girl was used to that. Still, hunger was something that never became easier. She looked through the glass window of the restaurant again. Inside, a group of people were laughing while sharing food around their table. One waiter placed a plate in front of them, and everyone smiled as the steam rose from the meal. The girl quietly swallowed and looked down for a moment. She didn't want to beg for money. She had tried that before, and it often ended the same way. People would shake their heads or wave their hands for her to move away. But tonight she had a different idea. Across the restaurant, near one of the walls, she noticed something she had seen many times before when passing by. The piano. It stood in the corner of the dining room under a small hanging light. It looked shiny and carefully polished. Sometimes during dinner hours a musician sat there and played soft music while people ate. Tonight the piano bench was empty. The girl stared at it through the window for several seconds. A quiet thought slowly formed in her mind. She hesitated at first. Her heart started beating faster as the idea grew stronger. Felt risky. People might laugh. They might send her away immediately. But the hunger in her stomach reminded her that she had little to lose. After standing there for another moment, she slowly walked toward the restaurant door. Two workers stood near the entrance greeting guests. They wore neat uniforms and smiled politely at the people entering the restaurant. When they noticed the girl walking toward them, their smiles faded slightly. One of them stepped forward and gently raised his hand. "Sorry," he said kindly but firmly. "This place is for customers." The girl stopped a few steps away. For a moment she almost turned around. But then she gathered her courage. She spoke softly, her voice careful and respectful. "I'm not asking for money," she said. The workers exchanged a quick glance. The girl continued, her words coming slowly. "I was wondering if I could play the piano for a few minutes." For a second the workers looked confused. "The piano?" one of them repeated. She nodded. "If I play for 5 minutes, could I have something small to eat?" The two workers stared at her, unsure if they had heard correctly. One of them looked through the window at the piano inside the restaurant, then back at the girl standing in front of them. A small laugh escaped him, though it was not meant to be cruel. The idea simply sounded strange. "You play piano?" he asked. The girl nodded again. Her expression was serious. She wasn't joking. A couple walking toward the restaurant slowed down slightly as they noticed the conversation at the door. They glanced at the girl with curiosity before stepping inside. The worker scratched the back of his head. "That piano is for professional musicians," he said. "I understand," the girl replied quietly. "I just need a few minutes." The other worker looked at her carefully. Her hands were slightly dirty from the street, but they were steady. Her eyes held a quiet determination that was difficult to ignore. Still, the situation felt unusual. "Where did you learn piano?" he asked. The girl hesitated. "A long time ago," she answered simply. Inside the restaurant, the dinner crowd continued talking and eating. The sound of glasses clinking and soft conversations filled the air. None of them knew what was happening outside the door. The first worker sighed gently. "Look," he said, trying to remain polite. "This is a busy restaurant. We can't just let anyone walk in and start playing the piano." The girl nodded slowly as if she understood. But she didn't leave. Instead, she stood quietly, her eyes drifting once more toward the piano inside the restaurant. The worker noticed that small movement. For a moment, something about the way she looked at the instrument felt different. It wasn't the look of someone pretending or joking. It looked like recognition, like someone seeing an old friend. A few seconds passed in silence. The street lights flickered softly above them, and another group of customers approached the entrance. As the workers stepped aside to welcome the new guests, the girl remained standing near the door. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited. The first worker glanced at her again. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" he asked. The girl gave a small nod. "I just want one chance," she said quietly. He looked at his coworker again, unsure what to do. Letting a street child inside a restaurant like this could cause problems. Customers might complain. But turning her away didn't feel easy either. The smell of warm food drifted outside again as the door opened for another guest. The girl's stomach growled softly, though she tried to hide it. Inside, the empty piano bench still waited in the corner of the room. And outside, under the glow of the street lights, the girl stood patiently, hoping someone would finally say yes. The girl continued standing near the restaurant entrance, while the two workers looked at each other, unsure what to do next. People kept walking in and out of the door, and each time it opened, the warm light and the smell of food floated onto the street. Inside the restaurant, the sound of dishes and quiet conversations mixed with the soft music playing from the speakers. The piano in the corner still sat silent under the small hanging light. From outside the window, the girl could see it clearly. One of the workers folded his arms and looked at her again. "You really know how to play?" he asked. The girl nodded once more. "I just need 5 minutes," she said softly. "If it isn't good, I will leave." The worker gave a small shake of his head. The idea still sounded strange to him. A street girl asking to play the restaurant's piano for food was something he had never seen before. Another worker who had been passing by stopped when he heard the conversation. "What's going on?" he asked. The first worker pointed toward the girl. "She says she can play the piano," he explained. The second worker looked surprised. He glanced at the girl, then at the piano inside the restaurant, and then back at her again. "For real?" he asked. The girl quietly nodded again. A short laugh escaped from him, though it was more out of disbelief than anything else. "You?" he said, not meaning to sound rude, but the surprise showed clearly on his face. The girl didn't argue. She simply stood there calmly. A few customers who were waiting to be seated had started noticing the situation. One man leaned slightly toward the entrance and whispered something to the person sitting across from him. Soon a few eyes were turning toward the door. The first worker lowered his voice. "This isn't a good idea," he said to his coworker. "What if she starts pressing random keys and disturbing everyone?" The second worker shrugged. "She said 5 minutes. That's still enough to annoy half the restaurant," the first one replied. The girl heard their conversation but remained quiet. She had expected doubt. People rarely believed her. Just then, the restaurant door opened again, and a middle-aged waiter stepped out holding an empty tray. He stopped when he saw the small group standing there. "What's happening here?" he asked. The first worker sighed. "She wants to play the piano," he explained. The waiter looked confused. "Play the piano?" he repeated. The worker nodded and gestured toward the girl. "She says if we let her play for 5 minutes, she only wants something to eat." The waiter stared at the girl for a moment. He looked at her worn clothes and tired eyes. Then he looked through the window toward the piano. Inside, customers continued enjoying their meals, completely unaware of the conversation outside. The waiter rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well," he said slowly, "it's not like the piano is being used right now." The first worker quickly shook his head. "That piano is expensive," he said, "and customers expect a professional." The waiter shrugged. "Maybe she knows something," he replied. A small group of people inside the restaurant had now started watching through the glass window. Curiosity was slowly spreading. The girl shifted slightly from one foot to the other but remained patient. She had spent most of her life waiting for chances that rarely came. Waiting another few minutes didn't bother her. The waiter leaned a little closer to the girl. "Where did you learn piano?" he asked gently. The girl paused for a moment before answering. "Someone taught me a long time ago," she said quietly. The waiter studied her face. There was no sign that she was joking or trying to trick anyone. She looked serious. Hungry, yes, but serious. From inside the restaurant, a soft laugh suddenly came from a nearby table. Two young customers had noticed the conversation and were whispering to each other. One of them pointed toward the girl through the glass. The second worker noticed this and sighed. "Now people are watching," he said. The first worker looked uneasy. "This could turn into a scene," he replied. The waiter looked back at the girl. "You understand," he said calmly. "If you go inside and start making noise on that piano, people will complain." "I won't," she said. Her answer came quickly and with quiet confidence. The waiter raised an eyebrow slightly. "You sound very sure." The girl nodded again. "I just need 5 minutes." The three workers exchanged another look. Inside the restaurant, one of the waitresses had now joined the small group near the window. She looked outside with curiosity. "What's going on?" she asked the customers sitting near the glass. "They say the girl wants to play the piano," someone replied. The waitress blinked in surprise and looked again at the girl standing outside. Back at the entrance, the first worker exhaled slowly. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though his voice didn't sound angry, just unsure. The girl lowered her eyes for a moment. For a second it seemed like she might walk away. But then she looked back up. "I'm not asking for money," she said again quietly. "Just one meal." Her voice carried a small weight of honesty that was hard to ignore. The waiter looked thoughtful again. 5 minutes, he thought. What harm could 5 minutes really cause? Still, it wasn't his decision alone. At that moment, the restaurant door opened once more. A tall man in a neat suit stepped out from inside. His expression showed mild confusion as he looked at the small group gathered near the entrance. The workers straightened slightly when they saw him. It was the restaurant manager. "What's going on here?" he asked. The first worker quickly explained the situation. The manager listened quietly while glancing occasionally at the girl. When the explanation ended, he crossed his arms and studied her carefully. "You want to play the piano?" he asked. "Yes," the girl answered softly. "And in return you want food?" She nodded. The manager looked through the window toward the piano sitting quietly in the corner. Then he looked back at the girl. For a moment he said nothing. The workers waited for his response. A few customers inside the restaurant were now openly watching the scene unfold. The manager took a slow breath. "This is unusual," he said calmly. The girl didn't reply. She simply waited. The manager's eyes moved to her hands. Even though they were a little dusty, they rested calmly at her sides. Not shaking, not fidgeting, just waiting. He had seen many people beg outside restaurants before, but this request felt different. Finally, he spoke again. "You understand something," he said. "If I let you inside and this turns into a problem, you will have to leave immediately." The girl nodded quickly. "I understand." The manager glanced once more at the workers. Then he looked back at the girl. "You said you need 5 minutes." "Yes." The manager paused for another moment. Then he slowly stepped aside from the door. "All right," he said. "You have 5 minutes." The workers looked surprised. The girl stood still for a moment as if making sure she had heard correctly. Then she gave a small grateful nod. And for the first time that night, she stepped toward the restaurant door. The restaurant door opened slowly, and the girl stepped inside. The warm air wrapped around her immediately. After standing outside in the cool evening for so long, the warmth felt almost unreal. For a brief moment she paused near the entrance. The sounds inside the restaurant were different from the busy street. Plates touched gently against tables, glasses clinked softly, and quiet conversations filled the room. The smell of fresh food was even stronger inside. Her stomach tightened again, but she pushed the feeling aside. Several people had already noticed her entering. A few customers looked up from their meals with curiosity. Others whispered quietly to the person sitting across from them. It was not common to see someone dressed like her walk into a place like this. The restaurant manager stood near the door with his arms folded. The workers who had been speaking to her earlier also watched closely. "Remember," the manager said calmly. "5 minutes." The girl nodded politely. She didn't rush. Instead, she slowly walked forward across the dining area. Every step felt louder to her, even though the room itself was not silent. She could feel people watching her. Some faces showed curiosity. Some looked doubtful. A few people seemed amused, as if they were expecting something funny to happen. But the girl kept walking. Her eyes were focused on one thing only: the piano. It stood near the far wall of the restaurant under a warm hanging light. The black surface of the instrument reflected the soft glow of the lamps around the room. The piano bench sat neatly in front of it, untouched all evening. To most people in the restaurant, it was just a decorative part of the room. To the girl, it felt like something much more. As she moved closer, a waiter quietly stepped aside to clear the path. The room grew slightly quieter as more people noticed where she was heading. A man sitting at a nearby table leaned back in his chair to get a better view. "Is she really going to play?" he whispered to his companion. Across the room, a couple paused their conversation and watched. The girl finally reached the piano. For a moment she simply stood there. The instrument looked even larger up close. The polished surface was clean and smooth, clearly well cared for. She slowly placed one hand on the edge of the piano, almost as if greeting it. Then she gently pulled the bench back and sat down. The movement caused a soft scraping sound across the floor. A few people shifted slightly in their chairs. The manager glanced at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes had started. The girl sat quietly on the bench with her hands resting in her lap. From where she sat, she could see the entire dining room. Many faces were turned toward her now. Some people looked curious. Others looked skeptical. One table near the window even had someone smiling slightly, as if expecting the moment to become awkward. But the girl didn't seem to notice any of it. Her attention slowly moved toward the piano keys. She lifted the cover gently and exposed the long row of black and white keys. The soft light from above reflected across them. For a moment, her hands hovered in the air. Then she lowered them slowly until her fingers rested lightly on the keys. A quiet breath escaped her. Across the restaurant, someone whispered, "Let's see what happens." A waiter who had been carrying plates slowed his steps and stopped near the kitchen entrance to watch. The room grew noticeably quieter. Not completely silent, but quieter than before. The girl looked down at the piano keys carefully. Her fingers moved slightly, as if remembering something. It had been a long time since she had touched a piano like this. The last time felt like another life. For a brief second, doubt flickered in her mind. But then another memory followed. A memory of someone patiently guiding her hands across the keys. A memory of warm afternoons filled with music. Her fingers relaxed. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she pressed the first key. A clear, gentle note filled the air. It was soft, but it carried across the room. Several people straightened slightly in their chairs. The girl pressed another key, then another. The first few notes formed a simple melody. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a quiet beginning. A few customers glanced at each other. "That's not bad," someone whispered. The girl continued. Her fingers moved slowly at first, carefully stepping from note to note. The melody began to grow. Each note connected smoothly to the next, forming a gentle rhythm. The sound of the piano blended softly with the quiet atmosphere of the restaurant. A waiter who had been halfway through pouring water into a glass paused for a moment. He listened. At another table, a woman who had been looking down at her phone slowly lifted her head. The music was becoming clearer now. The girl's fingers moved with more confidence. She was no longer pressing random keys. She was playing. Across the room, the manager shifted his weight slightly. His expression changed from mild doubt to quiet curiosity. The melody continued flowing through the restaurant. It was simple, but it carried emotion in every note. Customers who had expected an awkward performance were now paying closer attention. Some people leaned slightly forward in their chairs. The girl remained focused on the piano. Her hands moved more freely now. The nervousness that had been in her shoulders earlier seemed to fade. Her fingers began to glide across the keys with natural ease. The melody slowly deepened. More notes joined together, creating something richer. The sound filled the restaurant in a gentle wave. One man sitting near the center of the room slowly set down his fork. Another guest quietly pushed their plate aside without even realizing it. The room was no longer just curious. It was listening. The girl's head tilted slightly as she played, as if she could hear something beyond the room itself. Each movement of her hands looked practiced, comfortable, natural. The music rose slightly in volume, then softened again like a calm conversation. The manager glanced again at the clock. Only 2 minutes had passed. He looked back toward the piano. Something about the scene felt different now. The girl sitting at the piano no longer looked like a lost street child asking for food. In that moment, she looked like a musician, and the room was slowly beginning to realize it. The soft melody continued flowing through the restaurant, touching every corner of the room. And without anyone saying a word, the atmosphere had completely changed. The gentle melody continued floating through the restaurant. At first it had been simple and careful, but now the music was growing stronger. The girl's fingers moved across the piano keys with quiet confidence, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The room felt different now. Just a few minutes earlier, people had been laughing, chatting, and enjoying their meals without paying much attention to anything else. But now many of those conversations had slowly faded away. One man who had been telling a story at his table suddenly stopped in the middle of his sentence. He looked toward the piano with a puzzled expression, trying to understand how the music had changed the mood of the entire room so quickly. Near the window, a woman who had been quietly scrolling through her phone placed it down on the table. She leaned slightly forward, listening more carefully. The girl at the piano did not look up. Her attention remained on the keys in front of her. Her fingers moved smoothly, sometimes gently touching the keys, and sometimes pressing them with stronger emotion. Each note blended into the next one like pieces of a story being told without words. The melody began to grow deeper. The simple tune she had started with slowly turned into something richer. Soft low notes joined the higher ones, creating a sound that filled the restaurant from corner to corner. Even the staff in the kitchen had noticed the change. One cook pushed the door open slightly and peeked out. Another worker stepped closer behind him, curious about what was happening in the dining area. The waiter who had spoken to the girl earlier stood near the kitchen entrance with his tray resting against his hip. He wasn't moving anymore. He was listening. Across the room, the restaurant manager remained near the entrance. His arms were still folded, but his expression had changed completely. The doubt that had been on his face earlier was gone. Now he simply watched. The girl's shoulders relaxed as the music continued to flow. The nervous tension she had carried when she first walked into the restaurant had slowly disappeared. It was as if the piano had become the only thing in the world around her. Her fingers began moving faster now, dancing lightly across the keys. The melody rose and fell like a quiet wave. Some parts sounded peaceful, almost like a calm evening breeze. Other moments carried a deeper feeling, something heavier that seemed to touch the listeners in a way they couldn't easily explain. A man sitting near the center of the room slowly leaned back in his chair. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl at the piano. "That's beautiful," he whispered softly. At another table, a young couple who had been laughing earlier were now completely silent. They watched the girl carefully. There was something about the way she played. It didn't feel like a performance meant to impress people. Felt honest. Real. The girl's hands moved with the natural rhythm of someone who understood the music deeply. Each note carried emotion, as if the piano itself was speaking through her. One of the waiters quietly stepped closer to the piano, though he kept a respectful distance. He didn't want to interrupt the moment. The music shifted again. The melody slowed slightly, becoming softer and more thoughtful. The sound of the piano seemed to wrap around the entire restaurant like a warm blanket. Even the people who had been skeptical earlier were now watching with quiet respect. Near the back of the room, a man who had been eating alone placed his fork down on the plate. He didn't realize he had stopped eating. His attention had moved completely to the piano. The girl's head tilted slightly as she played, following the rhythm of the music. Her fingers crossed over each other with smooth movements that looked both delicate and practiced. It was hard to believe that someone who had been standing outside on the street just minutes earlier could create music like this. The manager glanced at the clock again. Only 3 minutes had passed. He looked back at the girl. Something about the situation felt almost unreal. When she had asked to play, he had expected a short and awkward moment that would quickly end. Instead, the entire restaurant had fallen into a quiet spell created by her music. The girl's hands moved again, shifting into a new part of the melody. This section sounded deeper, more emotional. The notes carried a feeling that many people in the room could relate to, even if they didn't fully understand why. A woman sitting near the piano quietly placed her hand against her chest. She felt a small tightening in her throat. The music reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. Maybe a memory, maybe a feeling from long ago. Across the room, another guest blinked slowly and wiped the corner of his eye with his finger. He looked slightly surprised at himself. The music had touched something inside him without warning. The girl continued playing, completely unaware of how deeply the room was reacting. Her focus remained on the keys. The melody began to build again. Higher notes sparkled above the deeper ones, creating a sound that felt both gentle and powerful at the same time. It was the kind of music that made people stop thinking about everything else for a moment. For those few minutes, the worries of the day, the busy conversations, and the noise of the outside world all seemed to fade away. The piano was the only voice in the room. A waiter slowly walked toward a table with a tray of food, but he moved carefully, trying not to make any noise that might disturb the music. Even the clinking of dishes seemed softer now. The girl's fingers slowed again as the melody approached its final section. The music became softer, almost like a whisper. Each note lingered in the air just a little longer before fading away. The room felt completely still. People leaned forward slightly in their chairs, as if they didn't want to miss even a single sound. The girl played a few more gentle notes, her hands moving lightly across the keys. The melody floated through the restaurant like a quiet goodbye, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed down. No one spoke, no one moved, they simply listened, and the music continued to fill the room with a feeling that no one there would forget. The final notes of the melody floated softly through the restaurant like a quiet breath. The girl's fingers slowed as they moved across the piano keys. Each note became softer than the one before it, almost like the music itself was gently saying goodbye. The room remained completely still. No one spoke. No plates moved. Even the soft sounds from the kitchen had faded away. The last note finally rang out and slowly disappeared into the quiet air. For a moment, nothing happened. The girl kept her hands resting lightly on the piano keys. She looked down at them for a few seconds, as if making sure the music had truly ended. Then she slowly lifted her hands. The silence in the restaurant continued. It lasted longer than anyone expected. Several customers exchanged quiet glances with each other. It felt as if everyone was holding their breath at the same time. Then, suddenly, someone near the back of the room began clapping. The sound broke the silence like a spark. Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant filled with applause. The sound grew louder and louder as people clapped their hands together with genuine excitement. Some customers even stood up from their chairs. The girl looked up from the piano with surprise. She hadn't expected this reaction. Her eyes moved slowly across the room as she saw people smiling, clapping, and looking at her with admiration. A few guests were wiping their eyes. The waiter standing near the kitchen door shook his head in disbelief while clapping. Earlier he had doubted that the girl could play at all. Now he looked almost embarrassed for thinking that. Near the entrance, the restaurant manager slowly unfolded his arms. His serious expression had softened into something warmer. He stepped forward a few steps, still listening to the applause filling the room. Customers at several tables began speaking at once. "That was beautiful. I didn't expect that at all. Where did she learn to play like that?" The girl remained seated at the piano bench, unsure of what to do next. Her hands rested quietly in her lap now. She wasn't used to attention like this. For most of her life, people on the street barely noticed her presence. And when they did, it was often with impatience or quick glances before walking away. But here, in this moment, every eye in the room was focused on her. The applause continued for several seconds before slowly beginning to fade. Some people kept clapping a little longer than others, as if they didn't want the moment to end. The girl finally stood up from the bench. She gave a small, shy nod toward the room. A few people smiled back warmly. The manager walked across the dining area toward her. The crowd parted slightly as he approached the piano. The girl noticed him coming and straightened slightly, unsure if she had done something wrong. But the manager's face didn't show anger or disappointment. Instead, there was something like quiet respect in his expression. He stopped beside the piano and looked at her for a moment. "That," he said slowly, "was not what I expected." A few customers nearby chuckled softly, agreeing with him. The girl lowered her eyes slightly. "I'm sorry if it was too loud," she said quietly. The manager shook his head immediately. "No," he replied. "It wasn't loud at all." He paused for a moment, glancing around the room at the customers who were still watching the conversation. "In fact," he continued, "I think everyone here would agree that it was something special." Several guests nodded in agreement. One man at a nearby table even clapped again briefly. The girl looked slightly confused by the attention. She had simply played the only way she knew how. After a short pause, she spoke again. "You said 5 minutes," she said gently. "I think my time is finished." The manager glanced at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes had passed indeed, but somehow those 5 minutes had felt much longer. He looked back at the girl. "Yes," he said slowly. "You kept your promise." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then the girl added softly, "May I have something to eat?" Her voice carried the quiet reminder of why she had asked to play in the first place. The manager blinked slightly, as if he had almost forgotten the original request. "Of course," he said quickly. He turned toward one of the waiters standing nearby. "Bring a full meal," he said. The waiter nodded immediately and hurried toward the kitchen. Several customers sitting near the piano exchanged looks with each other. One woman leaned toward the manager slightly. "She deserves more than just dinner," she said quietly. Another guest at the next table nodded in agreement. The manager heard them but said nothing yet. His attention returned to the girl. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The girl hesitated. She looked down at the floor for a moment. "A long time ago," she answered softly. The manager sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't push her. The waiter soon returned carrying a tray filled with food. Steam rose gently from the plate as he set it down on a nearby table. The smell of warm soup and fresh bread filled the air again. The girl looked at the meal with wide eyes. For a moment she simply stood there. "Go ahead," the manager said kindly. "You earned it." The girl slowly walked toward the table. She sat down carefully, almost as if she was afraid the moment might disappear. The people nearby watched quietly as she picked up a spoon and took her first bite. A small smile appeared on her face. It was the kind of smile that comes from relief after a long day. Across the restaurant, several guests continued whispering about what they had just heard. Some shook their heads in amazement. Others kept glancing at the piano, still surprised that such powerful music had come from someone who had walked in from the street. The manager remained standing nearby, watching the girl eat. The restaurant had returned to its normal sounds now, but something about the atmosphere had changed. People were speaking a little softer, smiling a little more, and many of them knew that they had just witnessed something unexpected. A moment that started with doubt had turned into something none of them would forget. The girl sat quietly at the small table while the warm meal rested in front of her. Steam slowly rose from the bowl, carrying the comforting smell of soup and fresh bread. For a moment she simply looked at the food, almost as if she wanted to make sure it was really there. The restaurant had slowly returned to its normal sounds again. Plates touched the tables, waiters walked between guests, and quiet conversations started again. But the mood in the room still felt different from before. Many people kept glancing toward the girl's table. Some of them whispered to each other, still amazed by the music they had just heard. The girl picked up the spoon carefully and took another bite of the soup. The warmth spread through her body, and for the first time that day she felt something close to comfort. She ate slowly, trying not to rush even though she was hungry. Across the room, the restaurant manager remained standing near the piano. He looked toward the girl from time to time, his expression thoughtful. A few customers were now speaking quietly with each other. One man leaned forward slightly and said, "I still can't believe that came from someone who walked in from the street." Another guest nodded. "There was so much feeling in that music," she replied softly. Near the window, a woman continued looking toward the girl while gently holding her glass of water. Something about the performance had clearly touched her. The manager finally walked over to the girl's table. He didn't want to interrupt her meal, so he waited until she finished another spoonful before speaking. "That food all right?" he asked kindly. The girl looked up quickly, surprised that he was standing there. "Yes," she said softly. "It's very good." She gave a small grateful nod. "Thank you for letting me play." The manager pulled out a chair and sat across from her. His voice remained calm and friendly. "You said someone taught you to play," he said. The girl looked down at the table for a moment. Her fingers rested around the edge of the bowl. "Yes," she answered quietly. "Someone in my family." The manager waited patiently, giving her time to continue. "My grandmother," she added after a moment. Her voice carried a mixture of warmth and sadness. "She had a small piano where we used to live." The manager listened carefully. "She loved music," the girl continued. "She played every day. When I was very little, she started showing me how to press the keys." The girl paused for a moment, remembering. "At first I just watched," she said. "But later she let me try." A small smile appeared on her face as she spoke about those memories. She always said music could help people feel things that words sometimes cannot. The manager nodded slowly. "That sounds like good advice," he said. The girl looked down again. "She passed away a few years ago," she said softly. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was clear. The manager remained quiet for a moment out of respect. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said gently. The girl nodded slightly. After that, everything changed. She didn't explain the details, and the manager didn't ask. Sometimes silence said enough. Across the room, several customers were still watching the conversation from a distance. One guest finally stood up from his table and slowly walked toward the manager and the girl. "Excuse me," he said politely. The manager turned slightly toward him. "Yes." The man looked at the girl with a friendly smile. "I just wanted to say your music was wonderful," he said. The girl looked surprised again. "Thank you," she replied quietly. The man reached into his pocket and placed a small folded bill on the table. "For your talent," he said kindly. The girl's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that," she said. The man smiled gently. "I want to." Before she could say anything else, another customer approached. Then another. One by one, a few guests from nearby tables walked over. Some simply offered kind words. Others left small tips on the table. The girl looked overwhelmed by the attention. The manager raised his hand slightly to calm the small crowd. "Let's give her some space," he said with a light smile. The guests nodded and slowly returned to their tables. The girl looked down at the money now resting beside her bowl. "I didn't play for money," she said softly. The manager leaned back slightly in his chair. "I know," he said. "That's why people are offering it." The girl didn't reply right away. She finished the last spoonful of soup and wiped her mouth gently with a napkin. The manager studied her thoughtfully. "You know," he said after a moment, "our restaurant sometimes has live music during dinner." The girl looked up, unsure where the conversation was going. "We usually hire musicians," he continued, "but tonight you showed everyone something special." The girl listened quietly. "I'm not saying you have to," the manager added, "but if you ever wanted a place to play again, we could arrange something." Her eyes widened slightly. "You mean here?" she asked. The manager nodded. "Of course, we would help make sure you have a proper place to stay as well," he added. The girl sat very still, trying to process what she had just heard. Earlier that evening she had walked toward the restaurant simply hoping for a meal. Now someone was offering her something she had never expected. An opportunity. Across the restaurant, several guests who had been listening from their tables smiled when they heard the manager's words. The girl looked down at the piano again. The instrument that had started everything. Her grandmother's voice echoed quietly in her memory. "Music can open doors that you cannot see yet." The girl slowly looked back at the manager. "I would like that," she said softly. The manager smiled. "I thought you might." Around them, the restaurant continued its evening as usual. But for many of the people in that room, the night had become something they would remember for a long time. A simple request for 5 minutes at the piano had turned into something much bigger. The girl had walked in hoping only to eat. Instead, her music had filled the room with emotion, kindness, and a new beginning. And the piano in the corner of the restaurant would never look the same again.